Someone mentioned that sin, betrayal by the first man, led the second to kill the third. When God finished creating our world, He declared it as very good. Few people today would argue that the world is in good shape. Something went terribly wrong. Genesis 3 tells us what the problem is and how it came to be. Man disobeyed God's instructions and, as such, was expelled from the garden. Genesis 4 recounts that Adam joined his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, "With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man." Later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Despite Adam and Eve being banished from the garden, God continued to bless them. Eva gave birth to 2 sons, Cain and Abel, with the help of the Lord. As both sons grew up hearing stories about God, they knew they should offer themselves to their Creator. Both boys were ready to worship over time. However, while the Lord was pleased with Abel and his offering, He was not pleased with Cain and his offering. Cain became very angry, and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" "I don't know," he replied. "Am I my brother's keeper?" Adam's own family can be found here. His oldest son killed his middle son for the same reason they killed Jesus centuries later: envy. Envy was responsible for the first and worst murders in history. Cain means origins. When he was born, Eve said, "I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord." Abel is a Hebrew word meaning breath or vapor. God chose Abel, the younger of the 2 sons, because He did not want anyone to think they had a natural right to His gifts and inheritance. God often chooses a younger person over an older one in the Bible. For example, Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau. The problem that separated them was that God accepted Abel's offering while rejecting Cain's. Abel learned from his parents that the only acceptable offering to God was a blood sacrifice, the result of the death of a life. God had already covered the sin and shame of his parents by sacrificing animals and making a covering for Adam and Eve with their skins. A principle was being established. Blood was shed to cover their shame. This began there and continued until Calvary. As a result, when Abel came to worship God, he brought a sacrificial animal with him, while Cain simply offered fruits and vegetables. God was only pleased with Abel's offering, not Cain's. This enraged Cain, despite God's warning that he should rule over it. Cain deceived his brother, killed him, buried him, and abandoned him completely. He said, "I am my brother's keeper." Cain's punishment is followed by the story of 2 families, a recurring theme in Genesis. Unfortunately, Cain's murderous ways were passed down through his family line. We find a man boasting of his own violence when we get to his great-grandson. "I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me," Lamech boasted. Note also that Lamech was speaking to his wives in the plural. God's perfect design has only 4 chapters, and yet we already find people reveling in bloodshed and disrespecting His design for marriage. She bore a son and named him, saying, "God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him." She also had a son, and he named him Enosh. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. Contrast this with Cain's line. God distributed a new lineage, a godly lineage. The Lord gave Eve a son named Seth in place of Abel. Seth exemplified the same kind of spirit as his late brother Abel. As people began to call on the name of the Lord in connection with Seth, the enthusiastic form of Cain's pride and self-focus pointed to himself. Seth's humble form of enthusiasm practiced by Abel, and Seth cries out to God. Jude 11 says, "Woe to them! They have taken the way of Cain. They have rushed for profit into Balaam's error. They have been destroyed in Korah's rebellion." It is no surprise then that when God needed an obedient servant hundreds of years later, He chose Noah from Seth's line. A clear pattern emerges here. The wicked despise the righteous, and the ungodly envy the godly. This is a division that has existed throughout human history. So God's perfect world has become a place where righteousness is despised, and people justify their wickedness. Anyone who questions their conscience is unconcerned. We could say that Abel was the first martyr because of righteousness. Jesus himself said that the blood of the righteous had been shed from Abel to Zechariah. The narrative continues by tracing Cain's line and includes some interesting elements, along with the names of descendants, involvement in music and metallurgy, including the first weapons. Cain's line was also responsible for urbanization, being the first to build cities, concentrating sinners in one place and thus concentrating sin. Because of this concentration, cities may have become more sinful than the countryside. As a result, what we consider human progress is tainted. Cain's mark, so to speak, is in these developments, and this is the biblical interpretation of civilization. Sinful activity is always at its core. Polygamy was also introduced by Cain's descendants. Until that time, one man and one woman were married for life, but Cain's descendants had many wives. We know that Abraham, Jacob, and others were polygamous. However, Adam and Eve's third son, Seth, marked the beginning of another lineage, a godly lineage. People began to call on the name of the Lord through Seth's lineage. These two lines run throughout human history and will continue to do so until the end when they are separated forever. This story offers us a profound moral lesson about the consequences of sin, envy, and lack of humility. The rivalry between Cain and Abel, evidenced in the first murder in history, highlights how pride and envy can destroy relationships and lead to future acts. Similarly, Cain and Abel's story reminds us that God values sincere and obedient enthusiasm like Abel's, rather than selfish enthusiasm like Cain's. The question that remains for each of us is, which side are we on? Are we following the path of Cain, feeding pride and envy, or are we seeking the humility and obedience exemplified by Abel and Seth? The choice is ours, and our actions define the course of our lives and our relationship with God. What reflection does this story evoke in you? Comment below. Until next time.